Well, it looks like we almost have a critical mass. Almost everyone's gotten food. We're delighted all of you could make it today. Sorry about the little delay initially with the food arriving late, but I'm glad it did arrive. This is the inaugural event for this year for the RGK Center for Philanthropy and Community Services Global Civil Society Speaker Series. We had a number of events last year, and we'll have additional events in the spring, so be on the lookout for publicity for that. But today I'm delighted to introduce our speaker, Gary Jenkins. He's a professor of law at Ohio State University, and prior to coming to Ohio State, he served as general counsel and chief operating officer of the Goldman Sachs Foundation. He has extensive experience working in issues related to philanthropy, having worked, as I said, with Goldman Sachs Foundation. And prior to that, was it Prudential?
Yeah, earlier and before law school.
Okay, so even before law school. He's a graduate of Harvard Law School and the JFK School of Government, so is well prepared to talk to us today about the intersection of two themes. So in addition to the RGK Center's support for this event, we also have the Strauss Center for International Security and Law. So it's entirely appropriate, given the subject matter of today's talk, to have the two centers coming together to support this event. Here today we have the topic of international philanthropy and the global war on terror. So both of the themes relevant to the RGK Center and the Strauss Center, well represented in the subject of today's talk. And so without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Gary. Thanks so much for coming, and welcome to UT.
Thank you. Thank you. Good afternoon, and thank you all for coming. I've been a great admirer of the LBJ School for a long time, so it's a pleasure to be here. Before I begin, I also want to thank my fine hosts, Professors Frumpkin and Bushby, who have been really gracious and wonderful. And I just have to tell you that you all have chosen brilliantly here in bringing Professor Frumpkin. He was a professor of mine when I was at the Kennedy School. I believe that I was a student in the very first class that he taught there, or at least certainly in his first year. So I'm happy to have been the guinea pig so that you could enjoy him now. But today I want to talk about international philanthropy and the ability of U.S. funders to make grants abroad, particularly in light of the war on terror. And if I were going to kind of shorthand my talk in a phrase, it might be called collateral damage. And by that I mean, in my view, I think that private foundations and public charities, U.S. private foundations and public charities, have essentially been viewed, or at least allowed to become, collateral damage in this effort. So what do I mean by that? Well, historically, the federal regulations regarding cross-border giving, the ability of U.S. funders to make grants abroad, has always been something that was considered difficult. And after September 11th and our global war on terror, it's become increasingly challenging. And today, a combination of federal executive orders, legislation, and administrative guidelines have really changed that landscape and the regulatory environment with respect to giving, and changed it in ways that I think are particularly troubling. Prompted by the Bush administration, I don't doubt that these measures were intended to enhance U.S. security interests. I think that they were really put in place with the best of intentions to protect American charities from abuse, and ultimately to keep all of us safe from the major concern. This has at least been connected with terrorist funding, the flow of funds. So the idea is to prevent money from getting into the hands of terrorists. However, I argue that the current policy may actually be undermining U.S. security interests in some really real and important ways. Efforts to regulate U.S. charities to prevent grant money from being secretly siphoned off by terrorists comes at some costs. And those costs include the inadvertent chilling effect of flowing charitable dollars overseas. It includes problems associated with reducing the amount of funding that's available to deal with some of the root causes of terrorism. So extreme poverty, inadequate access to health care, stalled economic development, poor education systems, all of those problems that most U.S. funders, private foundations, are working on. But more important, I think that these aren't merely administrative burdens that get imposed on U.S. grant makers, although there are some serious administrative burdens and costs imposed by the new regulatory regime, but that these burdens exact security costs as well. They're actually security costs that affect U.S. interests. And I think that these security costs have really been underappreciated by policymakers. Specifically, I believe that overseas grant-making activity serves as an ally in the war against terrorism by contributing to public diplomacy efforts and which support the positive image of the U.S. Abroad. And international philanthropy is an important tool of generating U.S. soft power, which is used to garner multinational cooperation when it comes to global affairs. Now, these costs might be considered worthwhile, worth it, if we had some real security gains, right? Because this is being framed as, wow, there are some security risks that we need to address. And if that were the case, then you might say, you know what, some burdens on nonprofits is the price that we have to pay. It's worth it. But I'm not convinced that that's the case. In fact, there's been no evidence that's been put forward by the government specifically that these concerns are real, i.e. that there are cases where U.S.-funded entities have seen their gifts being unwittingly duped by foreign charities, that the money is being siphoned off by foreign entities. By adopting policies that reduce the quantity of cross-border philanthropy, I think in many ways we're harming ourselves, that we're weakening this important element of our collective security interests. And mainly, this debate then about tightening foreign grant-making, regulation regarding foreign grant-making, gets framed as security versus administrative burdens. So security in the sense of we've got to get money, stop money from getting into the hands of terrorists, versus the administrative cost or burdens that are placed on U.S. charities. And I think that as long as the debate gets framed that way, then charities are in trouble. It's hard to win. It's hard for nonprofits to win if that's the term of the debate, if that's the way the debate gets framed or perceived. And I have two problems with the debate being framed that way. So first problem, as I mentioned, is that there's been no evidence that U.S. funders have been a source of funding for terrorists. There hasn't been one case where a U.S. grant maker like the Ford Foundation or Rockefeller has given money for cause X in a foreign country, but that money has been funneled to Al-Qaeda. And second, when policymakers think about international philanthropy, they're not taking account for the benefits that occur. It's viewed as this potential weak link, this area where we see a lot of risk, a lot of potential for harm, and vulnerability with respect to our security interests. But I see something different. I see international philanthropy as a frontline ally on the global fight against terrorism. I see international philanthropy as advancing U.S. security interests. Of course, the work undertaken by charitable organizations advantages the intended beneficiaries of the grants, but it simultaneously generates several important byproducts, benefits to American interests. And I think that if you start to consider those, if we start talking about those, if we acknowledge those, then we can change the terms of the debate. And that's so important because when you can start talking about, thinking about security benefits that come from international philanthropy, the way that having nonprofits be engaged in the world actually produces some security benefits to the U.S., then the debate gets changed, right? Now we can have a debate about security costs versus security benefits. And I think that's a lot more attractive. I think that's a playing ground, a setting, a situation in which nonprofits can actually really make a difference, at least in the arguments, and we can begin to rethink of the importance of cross-border giving and how we regulate it in ways that I just think we're not able to see right now because of the way that the debate has been framed. So basically, I'm advancing an argument that we may be cutting off our nose despite our face when it comes to regulating U.S. charities in the name of stopping terrorist financing. And the irony is that government efforts to make us more secure may actually leave us less safe. And at the very least, the calculation used to determine the security benefits offered by greater regulation must be altered in some ways to ensure consideration for at least the corresponding security harms that aren't being considered. So let me talk a little bit about where we are today, why this matters, and then I'm going to share some thoughts about where we might go from here, and then I'm going to open it up and we can have questions, comments, and have a discussion. So I know this isn't a legal audience, but I'm just going to provide a little bit of background on the law so that you can understand how U.S. public charities and private foundations with active international programs bear some significant burdens imposed by the regulatory measures enacted as part of the government's war on terror. Now, law regarding international philanthropy, as in the case with most areas or many areas governing law of nonprofits, is generally governed by tax law. Okay, so tax law is kind of the place where it all begins. And prior to the September 11th attacks, making grants to institutions outside of the United States was considered to be among the most difficult, the most time-consuming, the most onerous form of grant-making for private foundations. The highest level of diligence were to these grants, and that was in place before any of these changes. So I think it's just important to kind of understand where we were, where we're starting from. So the baseline was basically pretty high already. The specific legal rules governing overseas grant-making vary depending on the legal classification of both the receiving charity and the grant-making charity. So it gets pretty complex because it kind of depends on what kind of entity the U.S. entity is that's making the money, and then, is giving the money, and then the type of entity that's receiving the money, its legal status, how it's organized, where it's organized. All those things factor in to what legal requirements you have to do to actually effectuate the grant. Now, I'm going to spare you with the long version, but I'm going to try to boil it down to at least you can see that procedurally the least onerous method for a U.S. funder, either a public charity or a private foundation, to support a foreign entity requires the foreign charitable organization to apply to the IRS for recognition of its exempt status under Section 501c3 of the Internal Revenue Code. Okay, that is a highly unusual, expensive endeavor. Okay, so you can imagine most foreign entities that are operating wherever they're operating, they're not going to apply to the IRS, right? They're organized in their own country, they're a foreign entity, they're not going to apply to the IRS to be recognized. It's really difficult for them, it's really expensive for them. In an ideal world, that would be the easiest way for at least US funders to make grants. But for most foreign entities, that's not really an option. So putting that aside, public charities have greater freedom to operate and make grants abroad than do private foundations. With respect to private foundations, they can choose to be involved in international philanthropy either by making direct grants, direct cross-border grants to foreign entities, or they can make grants to entities here in the US that may operate abroad. So if you're here, you run the foundation, you've got a lot of money, you start a foundation, you want to give grants abroad, those are essentially your two options. You can find those entities that you think are really good in South Africa or Asia or wherever your interests are, you fund them directly, or you find entities here that may work abroad with them. Right? Those are your two options. If foundations choose to make direct grants, right? You want to get down in the grassroots. You want to work with the locals. If you choose to do that, you've got then two options to avoid being subject to federal excise tax. You can follow one of these two procedures. One is called equivalency determination, and the other is called expenditure responsibility. With equivalency determination, the first one, this basically entails a very structured assessment of a foreign charity. It's almost akin to the type of review the IRS would take if it were considering a U.S. charity, and you're saying that that charity is equivalent to a U.S. public charity, right? So you're making a determination that that charity meets all of the legal requirements that a U.S. charity would meet, which is beyond not just saying, oh, it's the equivalent for that country's system, for that country's rules of what we might call a nonprofit. That's not enough. You've got to document and say that it satisfies all of the requirements that a U.S. charity have to meet. So theoretically, if another country makes different policy choices, so for example, our charities here, there are limits about the amount of lobbying they can do in the U.S. If a foreign country makes a different calculation, right, and they may decide, you know what, we don't mind if nonprofits lobby, then you can't say they're equivalent, right? The entity has to meet every standard that the U.S. meets. It requires lots of paperwork, affidavits. Mostly, you need legal counsel to do that. There is a way that you can do it without it, but it's pretty rarely done. The second mechanism that I mentioned is expenditure responsibility. Foundations choose to exercise expenditure responsibility on grants which basically involves a strict set of rules established by Congress that provide extra scrutiny and oversight management. You've got to have segregated accounts. You've got to have certain reports that are required. This generally has a reputation for being difficult and time-consuming, but it's a way to make grants to foreign entities as well. So those are your primary options. Peter.
Point of clarity.
Yes.
I'm running the Philanthropy Family Foundation with a huge, massive endowment. We decide we're going to do both on global philanthropy. Why can't I get around both those requirements by just making my grant to a U.S.-based nonprofit, let's say the Synagogue Institute in New York, and we just instruct the Synagogue Institute to distribute the money to foreign charities as I Why can't I do that?
Well, you can give to a U.S. foundation, a U.S. charity that's working abroad, but you can't then tell them how to give the grants. So the rule is, there's the rule that when you give to that U.S. charity, they have to have what's called discretion and control. So when you give, so the public charity, they're a public charity, that they have to have discretion and control over the money that you give in order to give abroad.
That's so ambiguous. As a black man says, I can meet David Whitaker in New York. We can have cocktails. I can tell him, I really believe these are outstanding organizations in South Africa that deserve support. And he says, thank you so much for your input. I'm just saying, I think that there is another channel that people use all the time, which is just this intermediary model, where you basically put your arm around the intermediary and say, this is what I think. And the intermediary says, because he's getting whatever 10, 20% of the grant, thank you so much for your input. And then it's executed.
Right. That would be permissible. Right? You haven't made a legal requirement, whereas if you actually write in the agreement, it's got to go to XYZ, then the entity doesn't have discretion and control. I think you're right that does happen a lot, and actually part of my argument is that the intense regulatory regime is actually encouraging more of that, and because of that, those public charities, their due diligence requirements are actually lower than the requirements on the private foundations, right? They don't have to go through those two detailed processes that I just described. So essentially, I think that we're actually we kind of have created a system where we have less diligence because now entities are more likely to say, let's find an intermediary, it's a lot easier, and those intermediaries do a lot less diligence because they don't have to satisfy the requirements that a private foundation would make. So that's one of the huge aspects of what I'm saying is that we're kind of making these rules to make us safer, but in a lot of ways they actually may be having just the opposite effect because they incentivize foundations to act in such a way that is easier for them, but actually may lead to less diligence, less review of foreign grant partners. After the September 11th attacks, so the federal government pursued a variety of policy responses, of course, as you all know, intended to protect America and its allies from future attacks, and a campaign to curtail the financing of terrorist groups including funds that were channeled through charities, emerged as this top governmental priority. And as a result, several new tools were added to the government's arsenal to address terrorist financing, notably Executive Order 13,224 and the U.S. Patriot Act and the Treasury Anti-Terrorist Financing Guidelines, Treasury Department, U.S. Department of Treasury, anti-terrorist guidelines. And all of those affect philanthropic organizations engaged in overseas giving. The executive order blocks property and property interests of U.S. persons and entities deemed to be associated with terrorism. So also, in addition, it prohibits U.S. persons or entities from making contributions of funds, goods, or services for the benefit of those subject to the executive order. And the order authorizes the federal government to freeze the assets of anyone associated with any of these entities or people. So charitable organizations that may have knowingly or even unknowingly or unwittingly have provided support to or associated with a terrorist organization could be subject to this asset freezing under the executive order, right? So it doesn't require that a person be charged or have any knowledge or intent for a crime in order to block their assets. Therefore, assets can be frozen without any showing or allegation that an individual or entity violated law. The Patriot Act increases criminal sanction and permit civil actions against U.S. organizations that knowingly or intentionally provide material support for terrorism or terrorist organization. And the Act defines material support very broadly to include charitable grants, microfinance loans, technical assistance. Although the Act does require a knowing or an intentional violation, philanthropic organizations are concerned that despite their best efforts, to develop procedures and to prevent inadvertent supporting of terrorism, if their grants can be linked to such organization or purposes or persons, they may be found to have knowingly or intentionally provided material support. And such concerns, on the one hand, you can argue, well, maybe they're overblown, they're just being overly cautious. I think they could be reasonable for organizations that are operating, particularly in less developed parts of the world. The example that I often give is, imagine an organization is providing humanitarian aid in a war-torn or politically unstable region, and it finds itself necessary to interact or offer goods to a group with questionable ties, even if the U.S. government has designated that group a terrorist organization, in order to ensure that their aid trucks aren't destroyed on the way to getting to wherever they need to go. You give them, some things on the truck so they don't destroy the truck, or even worse, to your employees. And sometimes a lot of these, you're talking food, you're talking old T-shirts or whatever, that could actually be material support and could subject you to the Act. So I do think that there are genuine areas of concern for U.S. funders who are active in the developing world, where grant making is complex and precarious. The last thing I want to talk about is the Treasury ATF guidelines. Most regulations and guidelines concerning nonprofits, as I said, are issued by the IRS. But in November of 2002, the Department of Treasury issued their anti-terrorist financing guidelines, voluntary best practices for U.S.-based charities, to assist nonprofit organizations engaged in international philanthropy. And the practices include a variety of tasks. They talk about checking lists, terrorist watch lists, collecting background information on staff, on board members, on entities that subcontract with that those foreign entities may subcontract with, reviewing banking relationships, documenting and storing detailed kind of record-keeping backgrounds about people that you'll do business with. The official name given by the Treasury Department seems to belie the status of the guidelines. The Treasury ATF guidelines are billed as best practices, which implies that, we've surveyed foundations and we look to see what they do, and this is the best of what's done. Well, that's not really the case. Most of the things that are in here that were put in the guidelines were not best practices that were commonly in place, but they were new recommendations that Treasury Department was making. These were not things that were consistent with or common practice in the nonprofit sector. Interestingly, the ATF guidelines do not have the force of law. I don't know if you heard me say the word voluntary in there. And they impose no penalties for failure to comply. Also, compliance, though, does not provide a safe harbor. It doesn't protect entities in any way. It doesn't protect you from the executive order for the asset blocking or from the Patriot Act or anything. But despite their formal status as non-law, the guidelines continue to receive significant deference in the field from nonprofit managers and their advisors. And this is not, I think, because the sector views the guidelines as likely to help prevent funders or funds from being diverted to terrorists, but mainly out of fear or concern that if they don't follow them, the consequences will be worse. Essentially, they're being coerced. Each of these things individually, I think, may seem benign or modest or maybe even eminently reasonable to some of you. But I think when taken together collectively, they really do have a damaging effect, in part because they were issued by a government agency with the power to freeze assets. The Treasury ATF guidelines, despite their designation as voluntary, are at least being given quasi-legal status. Even non-binding guidelines can exercise a degree of constraint on certain activities when promulgated by a powerful government agency. So I don't think that we can ignore them. And operating as they do against the backdrop of the Patriot Act and the executive order, the Treasury ATF guidelines manage to, I think, conflate recommended practices with regulation, at least to a large degree. Now, the charitable sector has criticized the reforms primarily because they impose administrative burdens on top of the existing regulatory regime that already existed before September 11th, that still exists, all that substantial due diligence that was required. The government approach, in addition to just imposing administrative burdens, has had a chilling effect on international grant making. The imposing of administrative burdens reduces the quantity of international grant making. It impacts grantor-grantee relationships, in addition to assigning some investigatory tasks essentially through the ATF guidelines to nonprofits. I just think that is particularly kind of ill-advised because nonprofits, in my view, they're not well equipped. They're not likely to be effective investigatory agents. And I think asking them to do that is inappropriate and actually may be harmful to them, certainly in certain parts of the world where nonprofits are viewed not the way they're viewed here, but they're viewed skeptically. There's some places they may be viewed as agents of government, and I think that by imposing these duties, we may be actually making things worse in some ways. And unfortunately, as I mentioned in response to Peter's question, that the system, this regulatory environment, is creating these incentives for foundations to kind of give grants if they do want to be engaged, if they still want to be engaged in philanthropy through public charities as opposed to making grants directly across borders. And there is some statistical evidence to back that up that we can talk about if you want. Well, why do we care about that? Why does that matter? Well, in today's complex world, U.S. security is bound up with global affairs and issues. And I think that since the terrorist attacks, the U.S. Foreign aid and official development assistance, right, has taken on greater importance. Actually, we've actually increased aid to foreign countries significantly since then. There's been a dramatic rise of in funding, but the U.S., at least on not in total dollar value, but based on as a percentage of the economy, the U.S. is still criticized and ranks relatively low compared to our Western counterparts in terms of donating to foreign entities. And U.S. public charities, private foundations, if you took them together and you treated them as their own country, they would rank 6th on a list of 24 major countries in terms of giving. So if you just carve out U.S. public charities and private foundations, that's a lot of giving. And that's a lot of giving that we need to be concerned about, like how we change it or depress it can actually have real impacts. So in many ways, without a formal relationship, international philanthropy represents a form, I think whether we like it or not, but I think it's better to acknowledge it and talk about it. It's a form of public-private partnership between government and charitable organizations through which the nonprofit sector is really an ally in U.S. development assistance efforts. It's really supplementing, in a large way, a lot of U.S. giving and foreign aid. And accordingly, strong public policy interest, I think, exists to encourage international philanthropy, that we want to recognize this as important and encourage it. And international aid is an important weapon in promoting civil society and advancing social and economic development. And I think that by engaging directly with foreign NGOs, rather than indirectly through intermediaries, there are lots of advantages. There are lots of things that are gained from that direct engagement. Another important means in which international philanthropic activity supports U.S. security interests is through the building of a positive image of the United States, enhancing our public diplomacy efforts. Public diplomacy captures that dimension of international relations beyond official state-to-state diplomacy that's normally conducted through government officials. Instead, what public diplomacy does is it seeks to inform, it seeks to influence public attitudes of foreign citizens directly through the delivery of information, communication, outreach abroad, efforts to influence government broadly. And it's no secret that the U.S. is facing severe problems in this area right now. And I think international philanthropy can help combat that image. It can help improve the image of the U.S. when our entities are directly engaged with foreign counterparts. In addition, international philanthropy can provide a valuable source of soft power that benefits the U.S., which is related to, yet different, I think, from public diplomacy. The concept of soft power, I think, both captures and broadens the benefits and effects that are associated with positive image abroad. And soft power, as most of you probably know, is a concept primarily developed by and associated with Joe Nye, the former dean of the Kennedy School. And he argues that to succeed in foreign affairs, the government can rely on hard power, military and economic might, and soft power, right, which he defines as the ability to co-opt and others to want the same outcomes that you want through intangible attraction and shared values that end up shaping the preference of others in ways that make them want to want what you want. So the analogy that I use sometimes is I say that public diplomacy is in many ways more like public relations, and I think that soft power is kind of like brand management or brand image if you're kind of from the corporate world, right? The companies spend a lot of money on both. But they're actually trying to do something slightly different, but ultimately with the same goal. That's sort of the analogy that I like. But soft power, at least, reflects this indirect ability to elicit cooperation through this attraction to shared values, common aspirations, and the inspiration that you ignite in others. And he says that it's drawn from the country's values, their culture, their foreign policy, and it's built through a combination of government action and action by non-state actors. And ultimately, nations with significant soft power find that citizens of other countries aspire to share their values and institutions, and leaders of foreign countries view their policies as legitimate and want to follow their lead. Okay, so those are Nye's words. And with respect to non-state actors, Nye and others have focused largely on the influential role that culture plays in promoting soft value, culture and commerce. And he mostly focuses on Hollywood and movies and television as purveyors of culture, and commerce, big multinational companies that, McDonald's or whatever that you see all abroad that are American, but that are all over the world, that they're the conveyors of U.S. cultural values. And I take Nye a bit further to at least emphasize the role that U.S. public charities and private foundations also play, that they're a part of the effort of generating soft power of the United States, that international philanthropy communicates a message about our cultural values. And I think it's a very positive one. And the fact that we have entities that are engaged, that are giving, that are helping others, particularly in the developing world, actually inures to benefit the soft power of the U.S. I think that there are maybe a handful of nonprofits that have enough brand image, enough brand name, that you can even argue that they have their own soft power, right? That they're an entity, they're a behemoth in and of themselves. But I think that those are few and far between. They're, the Ford Foundation, the Gates Foundation, right? You've got to have kind of a lot of identity to be built up. But the Frumpkin Family Foundation or whatever, not quite yet, at least, is not. And I think a lot of the benefits that entities like that or others that are less well known, the benefits accrue to the U.S. generally. It's an American foundation, right? It doesn't matter what the name is. At the end of the day, it was the Americans that helped, that gave us the money for that. And I think that contributes to the soft power. In fact, I looked at the list of the 20 largest foundations, and I'm someone who's, I worked in foundations. The Goldman Sachs Foundation was the 10th largest corporate foundation in the U.S. I feel like I kind of know a little bit. And I looked at that list and I said, I've never heard of half these. And these were the top 20 U.S. funders. So, it's amazing, how many entities out there that really, I think, have little soft power of their own. Instead, it accrues, it's a byproduct, it benefits the U.S. generally. Now, for most organizations engaged in charitable giving abroad, especially in the developing world, this American aid that is considered that is ultimately considered part of our U.S. charitable tradition, values, and contributes to our soft power, I think heightens the importance of that role and allows us to see it as not just an administrative cost, but as something that can provide a security benefit, that we're actually getting more power, if you will, from that activity, which has a security dimension. So where do we go from here? Once we recognize and acknowledge the valuable contributions of international philanthropy to our security interests, then I think we can begin to develop a more complete picture about the security costs, right? Not just the administrative burdens and the trade-offs that are made in the current regulatory approach. Doing so, I think, could potentially lead to a shift in how nonprofits are viewed in this global fight on terror. Instead of being seen as kind of weak links in the security chain, they can be considered frontline allies. In a complex world, the U.S. government should adopt policies that take account of the security costs associated with regulating international philanthropy and the importance of building soft power. That's ultimately what I'm calling for. And essentially, I think by issuing the Treasury ATF guidelines as voluntary recommendations, these unofficial regulations have avoided the typical cost-benefit scrutiny required of significant regulatory action. And accordingly, private foundations and public charities, I think, maybe should advocate for a more formal cost-benefit review of the guidelines, to reframe that discussion as one in which the security advantages of what they do get accounted for. Right now, there may be, if anything, a thin veneer of consideration of these analyses and kind of a throw-off sentence here or there in a public statement that an official might make. But there really hasn't been, I think, a clear kind of articulation and argument that's been put forward, that's been dealt with on that issue. In my ideal world, I'd like to see the Treasury ATF guidelines withdrawn as we, I think, weigh what are speculative security benefits that they offer. None of the, I've yet to see a foundation that's come forward that said, wow, we think this really helps us, that we think this provides information that we needed that we didn't have before. And it's not clear to me, at least, how this effort to collect more data is going to help stop or thwart money from getting into the hands of terrorists, which again is a problem that all of this is about addressing, this concern about the siphoning off of funds from legitimate U.S. charities, which is a problem in and of itself that is yet to really be documented. Right now, it's just a theoretical concern. So in many ways, I think you've got the speculative benefits that all of these enhanced regulation offer against real cost, real security cost in the terms of soft power and public diplomacy. So some of the other recommendations, and I really am going to end just momentarily so that I can hear from you, is I think to the extent that the government's cost-benefit analysis determines the need to further regulate cross-border giving, then it should pursue a different strategy that reflects the security benefits that international grant-making provide. The U.S. government's current approach, which coerces the funders into conducting their own investigations, their own, this essentially blacklists potential terrorists, I think is kind of a wrong-headed approach, that at least if we're going to do something, you should be creating safe harbors for private foundations and public charities that are funding abroad, using that as a mechanism of saying, if you do these things, or if you give to these specific organizations, then you don't have to worry. But put the onus where it belongs, which is on the government to do that, not on the nonprofits. And lastly, I think that acknowledging the many ways in which international philanthropy benefits us and benefits our security, it allows us to kind of rethink the whole system, that we can rethink what's at stake and what's gained, and that might allow us to do even more than just roll back regulation that I'm complaining about, but we may actually rethink some of the things that were in place before September 11th and think about leaving in what's good there, right, which encourages people to do good due diligence, right? We want to do that. But there are some requirements that I think could be changed without putting our security at risk that actually might make it easier and encourage more giving abroad. And I'm happy to talk about those in detail in the Q&A if you want. They're a little bit technical, but not so much so that you can understand them. But I think there are some changes that could be made without sacrificing or engaging security. So since September 11th, I think that U.S. funders have become, at best, collateral damage, and at worst, targets in the government's campaign on the war on terrorists or terrorist financing. And the terms of the debate, thinking about nonprofits need to be revised. They need to be reconsidered. The perception that the regulation of international philanthropy pits security benefits against administrative costs misframes the stakes. Federal measures affecting international philanthropy and foundations working abroad need to be viewed as essential strategic allies in our efforts, and only in doing so will we enhance the United States' global influence, its strength, and ultimately lead us to, I think, a safer place. Questions?
I got a question.
Peter.
I think there's a little, I think the general argument is compelling. I think there's a little bit of a possible weakness in your point. You make the claim that security benefits are, we take those, we measure those, we take them seriously, but we can't really understand, and we don't take seriously soft power. So we think we'll make it safer, but we don't think about the cost to our soft power. But the problem is, how do you measure either cost or benefit in terms of soft power? Because that comes down to measuring, in some ways, the efficacy of foreign philanthropy or international philanthropy. I mean, it's very hard to shift it from the debate from administrative burden to the benefits if you can't quantify the benefits. I would suggest it's extremely hard to quantify the benefits of foreign philanthropy, foreign aid, whatever you want to call it. A lot of these projects don't go so well. A lot of them have complex endings that we don't even know how to assess what happened. So I just think there's an element of performance measurement imprecision on the soft power side that makes it hard and makes it a lot more understandable to me why people want to focus on the administrative burdens of this rather than the soft power benefits, because we can't track those very well. You can't argue, you can't demonstrate those very well. They're very hard to really show. So I just wonder if you reflect on how you actually assess net soft power gain or loss. I mean, where do you start? If you want to substitute that into the bid, how do you do that?
It's a great question. Certainly not an easy one. I think that I think you're right. It's very hard to quantify something that's so diffuse. I mean, that part of the whole concept, even when you're explaining the concept of soft power, the whole idea of it is very diffuse, that I think even on its own terms makes it very difficult to measure. Certainly some of the public diplomacy stuff you could measure, right? We can polls and other things could be measured to some extent. But I would say this, that the 9/11 Commission, there are lots of folks that, at least I think, take the concept seriously. And by doing so in this context, I think at least it gets you talking security to security. And there, yes, I'm talking about something, a concern, a critique that the guidelines are and the others are intended to address is speculative, in the sense that they're claiming that this might happen, even though we have no evidence that it has happened in the past, and these gains are maybe not measurable the same way. I don't know if they're speculative in the same way. But even if you think that, at least it becomes, I think, a security to security debate, and I just think that's a stronger place to argue from. I think ultimately that's just a better positions nonprofits in a better place to win if it can be framed or viewed that way.
I would think that if someone asked that question again in another setting, the way I would answer it, if I were to take a naysayer, is this is my answer would be soft power doesn't adhere to the effects of international philanthropy. It adheres to the intentions. So who cares whether or not these projects work, whether or not they actually. What matters in the soft power comes from the effort of trying. And so you could defeat the complaint that soft power is too nebulous to measure by saying it really adheres to the intention and the expressive caring that international philanthropy represents, as opposed to the net benefit, development benefits, or local benefits that it creates. So that'd be the response I'd throw back at the troublemaker like me.
He's still the teacher. I love it. No, I appreciate it.
But in some ways, it does explain to me a little bit why it has been framed in terms of burden, because administrative burdens can be chronicled, numbers of forms, numbers of procedures, and it's just more concrete. And you got to be ready. I think you got to be ready to stand for this idea that soft power isn't necessarily even about achieving results for community law. It's about expressing caring.
Right, which I agree. Maybe I misunderstood your question as I thought it was a step further. How do we know that even the expression of caring actually creates more soft power? How do you measure that? Is how I interpreted your question.
I was thinking soft power here from successful development projects or successful overseas, but really it doesn't have to.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. It was more. I didn't think to answer that way because I thought you were asking the next step question.
You're ready for the next trouble.
but I agree. Any other questions or comments or? Yes.
What is your opinion on the recent court cases?
Yeah.
The U.S. brought cases against another Muslim.
The Holy Land Foundation. So there are 5 cases of U.S. Muslim charities. Now the difference here is, basically what I've been talking about are foreign charities, whereas these are actually U.S. entities that have been essentially shut down. And the only case in which, of the 5, that Holy Land is the only case that government brought terrorism charges, right? So on all the other cases, they shut down the charities, but they can never build a case, or at least on terrorist charges. There was one that had a guilty plea, but it wasn't based on terrorist charges. And by the way, I should mention 3 of them dealt with Hamas, and only 2 of them even dealt with bin Laden or Al-Qaeda. And so Holy Land was kind of their big case, and for those of you that don't know, recently the case was there was a hung jury, so the judge had to dismiss the case. So it's not clear to me, or at least I don't think it's clear yet, as to whether or not they will try to bring the case again. But as one article I read said that basically, if you can't win the case, no offense, but here in Texas, then the government is in trouble in bringing these kind of cases. And I think that, based on what I've read, now part of the problem is so much of it is classified, right? So much of the information, even when they bring charges, they say it's classified information. So even people that they bring charges against don't have access to the records. It's very difficult for them to defend these claims, and let alone for an outsider like me to kind of really evaluate them. But I've not been impressed by the claims against the charities. And I think that really what Georgetown law professor David Cole has said, that this is really, he equates what's happening with the Muslim charities, he compares it to McCarthyism and the McCarthy period. And he says that, we're essentially, the material support statute, the closing down, it's a guilt by association. And government is really bringing flimsy to no evidence and closing these entities down, freezing assets. indefinitely, and let's put it this way, I'm not inclined to disagree with him, on his assessment. Yeah.
I worked at an organization that was Ford Foundation funded, and we had to sign, this was after 9/11, each of the grantees had to sign something saying we are not a terrorist organization, basically. So was the Ford Foundation pulled before Congress, or what happened with the Ford Foundation after?
Well, a lot of the certification is actually one of the recommended best practices in the Treasury ATF guidelines, that you have something that you ask them to certify that they're not terrorists, which I just think is kind of nonsensical. I mean, if you really are secretly trying to dupe the Ford Foundation or whomever into making you a grant for a charitable purpose, but you're really going to use it for illicit purpose, oh, but they asked me to sign something, then I'm not going to lie. I just think that's crazy. I mean, it's just inane to think that that's really going to be effective. But it has been put into some grant agreements. A lot of entities have criticized it. They think it, it's embarrassing. It kind of sets things off in a hostile way that, it really shows a lack of trust or respect to grantees. And that's something that, foundations, particularly wealthy Western foundations working with foreign entities abroad, there are all types of issues, I think, to begin with about power indifferences that make those relationships delicate at best. And certainly, I think that's not it's not helping the matters, and I don't see how that's really helping us, making us safer from terrorists by asking people to sign something that says you're not a secret terrorist, after all. Yes?
I have a question that kind of connects with that. I'm just wondering, in your opinion, if this, this analysis of global philanthropy as a mitigating factor, to kind of improve our image abroad, does that take away at all from the reason why this philanthropy exists in the first place, which I'm assuming, is to improve the standard of living and the quality of life in, the global south? I mean, do you think it's kind of taking away from the central purpose of this giving?
Well, that's why I like to frame it as a byproduct. I can see how one would be concerned about that. And one of the things I talk about is one of the powerful things about nonprofits is they're separate from government, right? And so one of the things when I make this argument is I don't want them to be seen as arms of the government. In fact, that's one of the things I criticize the guidelines for, is asking nonprofits, foundations, to do things that are really more like government functions in terms of investigatory tasks and the like. And when you blur the line between NGO and government, there are probably some things that are lost there. So I'd like to think that at least what I'm arguing is not so much that they are government, but that what they do benefits government as well. But the more that they're separate from government, the more that they can actually benefit government by being seen as separate from. You do have some countries now, as I'm sure you know, that the NGO, the government operated NGOs, that they're essentially creating some governments, at least allegedly China and some others, are creating what are billed as NGOs, but they're really kind of strongly supported by government, kind of infiltrating groups, being out there defending government policies under the guise of nonprofits. I think that's probably a bad thing, right? That weakens the trust that we might all have in nonprofits. So I do think it's important that nonprofits remain independent from government, but that doesn't mean that the work that they do doesn't necessarily provide some benefit to government. And that's what I think I'm talking about. Josh?
So I wanted to go back to this question about the extent to which it's a speculative problem versus a real one, because you make the distinction between public charities and private foundations, and it sounds like the ones that have been implicated potentially are public charities as opposed to the foundations. And so I'm wondering, it seems like when you read about diaspora groups, the Tamils based in Lanka, but they have diaspora groups into Canada and elsewhere where you can see there's a potential problem of them being agents for whatever their nationalist or insurgent activity is in the homeland. And it seems like that's a real problem, not a speculative one. And so some of the stuff that you've talked about suggests that what I don't understand is what leads you to think that it's a speculative problem? Sure. So that's the sort of, as opposed to a real one, when we see evidence that may be hard to prove, and maybe that's why the government's sort of shutting it down and can't build a legal case, but it seems like there may be something there. And the second is, you talk about a chilling effect. Is that noticeable in terms of the streams of resources that foundations are directing towards international development causes? Is there some evidence to suggest that that's had that effect, or or even anecdotal stuff that you can draw on?
Yeah, there's lots of anecdotal evidence of chilling and lots of statements that I can quote you from lots of folks who talk about it, or in the field, who talk about a chilling effect and talk about entities not moving into international philanthropy because it's just too hard now. There's also some statistical evidence to show that not so much that overall international giving has gone down, which is in part largely because at the same time we've had the emergence of the Gates Foundation, right, which is almost exclusively, or the large majority of their grants are international, so overall international giving is high. But what we have seen a decrease in is the amount of direct cross-border grants, the amount of grants from U.S. private foundations to foreign entities, and both in terms of dollar value and in terms of volume. The studies have shown a decline in that area, and the declines have been a lot greater, than any decline comparing U.S. giving. That really there's something happening with international philanthropy there. With respect to the first problem, the first question that you raised, I distinguish between what I call direct abuse and indirect abuse. And so the cases that I talked about are direct abuse, meaning U.S. entities, those Muslim charities were U.S. entities. They filed with the IRS, and they purposefully misled. If you think they did something wrong, I should say, like it hasn't been proven, but let's just say, but the idea, the abuse that would happen is it's direct, that its managers kind of fraudulently said we're going to do things charitably, but then we really intentionally sent them to terrorist activity. And the guidelines, the regulatory environment that I'm talking about don't address. That's not what they're aimed at addressing. They don't apply to any of those entities because those were U.S. charities. They had their U.S. Donor letter, so giving to them was not given to a foreign organization. Even though that they were going to do work abroad, they were actually U.S. entities. What the guidelines and the rest of the regulatory regime that I'm talking about are geared towards giving to foreign entities. Who the U.S. funder thinks is going to do something charitable with the money, and then they secretly siphon off money. I call that indirect abuse. So, and that's what certainly the ATF guidelines and what I call this regime are really aimed at dealing with that second problem, whereas what you described and what the evidence that we do have are all cases of the first problem. So I think you have a mismatch in terms of, kind of where the potential, where the abuse, the evidence of abuse that exists, where it is. Is it possible that some other type of indirect abuse has happened? Perhaps, but we've seen no evidence of it. And I think that in large part, the guidelines, I'm not sure that I don't see, and most of the people in the sector don't see, how the guidelines and the new regulatory burdens that are being placed on nonprofits are going to help them ferret out that abuse. That by asking them to sign the statement, by collecting information about the subcontractors that you use, how that's going to help them figure out the indirect abuse seems certainly not clear to anyone. And I just think it's interesting. One of the things I note in the article is one of the things that they ask nonprofits to do when you're dealing with foreign charities is to collect information on all the staff, all the board members, and all of the subcontractors that any nonprofit deals with. And you're supposed to get birthplace and addresses and all this kind of background information about all these people. That we don't do that. There are no equivalent when you're dealing with foreign businesses, right? We don't ask. There's no equivalent Treasury Department recommendation even that says, oh, if you're going to do business and transfer money with a company abroad, that you should be collecting information on all of their staff, all their board members, and every subcontractor that they deal with. And I see one of two explanations. Either we just don't care about burdening commerce and business the way we care about burdening nonprofits, or I think that when you think about it in the context of a corporation, a multinational corporation that does business, to ask them to get that kind of information on every foreign entity that they deal with, it would be nonsensical and overwhelming to kind of gather that much data. I just don't think that you would even think that that's going to be helpful in fighting the war on terrorism. And I think you have the same thing at work here. Yes?
Do you think the security concerns and benefits transfer that you were talking about transfer to the U.S.-based Muslim charities?
I think they're not as much, not at least in the way that I think there are other concerns about that. I think there are other concerns that we could have about those. But, at least the arguments about soft power and other things, I guess you could think that maybe they apply because then they do go out and do work abroad, even though they're U.S. entities. So, in some ways, yes, and it does certainly impact our image abroad and public diplomacy. So in that sense, I do think that yes, you could make some of those same arguments. I do think, though, that you have the difference there being if entities are supposed to be using funds for a charitable purpose and they're not, whether it's to help terrorists or it's to sweeten go live in the Riviera or whatever, that's got its own set of legal issues that should be dealt with and that the government should be dealing with. And I think it would be legitimate to deal with those issues. I agree with David Cole, the Georgetown law professor that I mentioned before, about the way in which these things have been handled. But I think that theoretically, if they were true, then I wouldn't have a problem with what's being done, although I would do it a different way.
Right. But with
I'm sorry.
International philanthropy, theoretically, if it were true as well, wouldn't there still be a problem?
With respect to international.
With the U.S. foundations giving to, if in fact it were true that they were giving to foreign charities that were siphoning off, that's a problem as well, in the same way that it's a problem if it's U.S. charities.
Right.
So, I'm not sure I see, I see what you're saying about soft power, although soft power is not the, intrinsically very good, but that's not the ultimate goal. The soft power is good in that it prevents terror. That brings us closer to satisfying our security concern.
That provides some security benefits
Yes.
that I think are unaccounted, yes.
But so in the U.S. charity realm, the goal is a security benefit, not necessarily soft power, right?
the goal of giving to U.S. charities?
No, I mean,
I'm sorry.
you're saying that the security costs, and the original question was, do the security costs and benefits transfer to the U.S. Muslim charities, right? And you said that you didn't think so because you don't get, for example, soft power, which I agree with. You don't get soft power, but the goal of soft power is to have a security benefit anyways.
Well, no, I meant, and also it was my fault. I kind of took us down that bad road. Well, the regulatory regime hasn't really changed with respect to U.S. funders to giving to U.S. charities. We haven't made any changes there. So my argument is really talking more about the way we burden U.S. funders that are making grants now abroad, right? That's changed, but making grants to U.S. funders, nothing has been changed there, so it's not really a difference there.
Well, I want to draw it to a close and thank all of you for coming today. I want to give Gary a round of applause. And, we'll be around for a little bit if you want to ask questions offline. And if you have questions for Gary or about his work, he also has a North Carolina Law Review article. So if you Google Gary Jenkins terrorism, his paper will come up as like the third source on Google. You can download it. I encourage you to do so. And feel free to stay in touch. And we're delighted you can make the first RGK Center Global Civil Society Speaker Series of this term and look forward to events next. Thanks again.
Thank you.